Gives me great pleasure now to come to the first substantial bit of the day, that of a presentation on transport from Professor John Whitelegg. John is my favourite sort of expert. He's an expert in creating a future that looks thoroughly lovely, whilst himself being thoroughly lovely. It appears that he's written more books than I've actually read, and has been at the heart of transforming transport in California and lots of Europe, and Shropshire is especially lucky to have him living here. So I'd like you all to give a really warm welcome, not quite sure how we do that on Zoom, but in your hearts, a warm welcome to John, and I hand the floor over to John for a 15-minute presentation. Thank you.
Richard, good morning, everyone. I'm always suspicious of technology, but here we go, and I hope it's working well and you can hear me and you can see me. It's an amazing pleasure and privilege to be part of this exciting project, and I'm very pleased indeed to be able to do my 50 minutes, even though I guess I will be too brief on some things.
10.
From Sweden, where I'm located at the moment, and I've worked in Sweden for about 15 years, and that contributes a great deal to my growing optimism as things around me look pessimistic. I'm a very optimistic person about our ability to intervene in transport and climate change. There's a lot we can do. And Sweden, with its fossil fuel free policy, 100% renewable energy policy, totally integrated transport in terms of road and rail and bus and everything else in rural areas, is a paragon, an exemplar, best practice example. And I intend to be positive this morning. The opening slide that you can see there, you will recognise from Ludlow. I'm grateful to Councillor Boddington for his permission to use this. And there is a lot, of course, that we need to worry about with climate change. And I'm not going to go there because I want to hopefully describe, reveal, open up the possibilities for putting everything right and doing that very quickly. Next slide, please, Steve, if you're still there. Shropshire is a very, very interesting place in terms of transport share of carbon dioxide emissions. This very, perhaps oversimplified diagram, but from government climate change CO2 data, is basically showing the percentage contribution from the three things you see there: industrial and commercial, domestic and transport. And you see the yellow line in transport going up and up and up. We're now on, in Shropshire, we're now on about 37% of all our CO2 emissions are from the transport sector. And this diagram, by the way, is based upon a subset of data. I'm excluding our very polluting diesel trains, which run through Shropshire, and excluding motorways. And I don't think we have many of them in Shropshire anyway. So 37% is actually very high on a European scale. Very often European data refers to 25%, 27%, 30%. So we're on 37%, but the diagram doesn't convey the full picture that I want to try and convey in the next couple of minutes. That as we get more successful at reducing CO2 emissions on the industrial and commercial and domestic premises sources, the transport percentage goes up. And the transport percentage goes up every year, year on year, is the fastest growing sector in terms of sources of CO2 data. And there is very little actually out in the world of actual practical application. What are we doing to decarbonise transport? So basically the situation is bad and it is going to get worse. But I hope to show that we will have some optimism about how we can do it, and that this project will produce concrete information, practical suggestions, implementable things that we can do to decarbonise transport in Shropshire. Next slide, please, Steve. This is putting it slightly differently, but just to show you the previous slide was percentage contribution. This is megatons of CO2, and this is UK greenhouse gas emissions, and transport, you see, is very, very large. And those of us working in transport and climate change and decarbonisation generally are very concerned indeed. In fact, I have colleagues in many countries who say that the growth of greenhouse gases from transport has more than enough potential to cancel out all the savings in all other sectors and to make sure we do not reach Paris climate targets. Next slide, please. Just a little bit of detail that will help, especially in this afternoon's breakout groups, where a very interesting small number of presentations will be made about walking, cycling, buses and trains and public realm and so on. In terms of where the greenhouse gases come from in transport, this is UK data, 56% from passenger cars and about 30 or 31% from lorries and vans, light duty vehicles. This is the famous Amazon factor, DPD and all the rest of it, deliveries, which are going up and up and up and up, of course. So we are looking at perhaps a bigger share in terms of commercial traffic than people were aware of. Passenger cars, of course, critically important, and we have to get to grips with decarbonising the passenger car fleet. Next slide, please. Also, what tends to be forgotten in a lot of transport and climate change discussions is the distances over which we travel. Frequently, there are assumptions in national and also local authority transport policies that most of us are travelling very long distances. But if you have a quick look at this little pie chart, you see that about 18% of all our trips, 18% are less than 5 miles in length, and a further 18% 5 to 10 miles. So basically, working in transport is fascinating because most of our trips are relatively local, and most of our trips are undertaken in ways, often by car for short journeys, but in ways that can switch to walking, cycling, buses and shared modes of transport. So we need to be able to get to grips with attacking the carbon share from local traffic. Next slide, please. The really good news, and I am positive, I am optimistic, that always happens when I'm working in Sweden, is that we do know how to decarbonise transport. The amount of research has gone on into this subject for the last 20 years, in Britain and in Germany and in Sweden and in Austria and in Switzerland and many other places, is phenomenal. So the first thing to note is, even though in Britain we tend to say it's very difficult, we create a kind of scenario or an atmosphere where we think it's difficult to do things. We can achieve 100% decarbonisation of land transport. If I had more time, I'd love to talk to you about aircraft and shipping and other things, but that's not part of our subject today. If you look at that little, those illustrations in this slide, the Zero Carbon Britain is from the Centre for Alternative Technology in Machynlleth, and the one on the right is from the Stockholm Environment Institute, a zero carbon vision for UK transport. All the details are set out, all the interventions, everything we need to do in order to decarbonise land transport is known, is documented. The Stockholm Environment Institute report there on the right was actually sent to central government for comment and they didn't reply. Next slide, please. In the general world of transport, not only climate change, carbon dimensions, but things like air quality, public health, road safety and so on, there is a kind of template framework, a system of actually looking at what we can do. How can we intervene in transport? And this is known as the avoid, shift, improve concept. Now, because time is short, and Richard will shut me up very soon if he's paying attention, I don't have time to go into great detail. But the key thing about this diagram is if we are to reduce CO2 emissions in transport, we have to do the lot. We have to do the avoid, the shift and the improve. Avoid is all about planning, is spatial planning, reducing the need to travel, reducing the distances we travel. So for example, sticking lots of new houses on big greenfield sites miles away from buses in Shropshire is the wrong thing to do, makes things worse. We can reduce the amount of travel that we need to do by co-locating things, by doing so-called travel plans in businesses and so on. There's a whole toolkit or a box of interventions we can get to. We also do to shift. Shift is about how can we switch car trips willingly, easily, cooperatively, nobody's under pressure, nobody will be forced, from car to walk, cycle and bus under different sets of circumstances. And improve is about improving the actual vehicles, the energy efficiency of vehicles, whether they're electric, whether they are, or whatever, whether they're hydrogen or whatever, but also taking account of another factor that's often omitted, the weight of our vehicles and the weight of the batteries and so on. It's improving the technology of the vehicles. The key thing here is, and this sometimes makes me unpopular in discussions in sustainable transport, electric vehicles are not the solution. They are not the answer to decarbonising transport. They're part of an overlapping, integrated set of interventions: avoid, shift, improve. We need to reduce the amount of travel. It used to be UK government policy in 1994. Reduce the need to travel. We need to shift to walk, cycle and bus, and we need to make sure that the remaining vehicles, there will be less of them, and people will drive many miles less, will be more efficient, either electricity or other things. Next slide, please. I've already said a little bit about Sweden. The thing that is not understood in Britain, where there tends to be a view that if you live in darkish Shropshire, that it's really, really, really rural and really, really, really remote and you can't do clever things. Well, you can. In Sweden, they do a large number of clever things to provide alternatives to the car, like a regional transport authority, totally integrated bus and rail. And Sweden provides many examples of exactly how to do that and how to work with the grain of the way people make choices to use cars less. Next slide, please. This is just an example from one part of southern Sweden, the Lund, L-U-N-D, Lund municipality, where the plan, which is currently being implemented and monitored, and they're achieving their targets, is 70% of all travel will be made by public transport, walking or cycling by 2020, and 75% by 2030. Now, an English rural council, Shropshire, Wiltshire, Gloucestershire, doesn't matter what, would not believe this is possible. But it is possible, and this is taking place in places smaller than Ludlow, smaller than Bridgnorth, and about the same size as Bishop's Castle. We can do far more in this area of sustainability, climate change and transport than we normally expect to be able to do. Next, please. Okay, Swedes do what they do because they generally think they will lead the world, and because they link it to the economy. All these interventions make economic sense. There's a vast amount of research not understood in Britain at all that shows that low levels of car use, sustainable transport, and all the intervention that will be explored this afternoon are actually cheaper than doing the bad things. If you build new roads and build multi-storey car parks, it's very expensive. It makes economic sense. It creates new business opportunities, green jobs, and it avoids the high costs that are associated with not doing it. According to the World Health Organization, we have a global epidemic. This isn't coronavirus, it's not COVID-19. We have a global epidemic because people sit on their bottoms. They sit in cars. Even if it's a really, really, really smart electric vehicle, they're still sitting on their bottoms and they're not getting physical activity. And the Swedes believe, unsurprisingly, in fairness, social progress and public health. And they do the interventions to reduce carbon emissions because of the multiple co-benefits. Next slide, please. And this is my view about the whole Ludlow project, the whole Ludlow South Shropshire constituency project. My view is very clear. The Swedes are smart, but so are we. We can do it. There's nothing to stop us doing it. We just have to coalesce around what needs to be done, on what time scale, and make sure that we talk to our politicians, our councillors, national government, local enterprise partnerships, everybody, and say, look, it's time to stop faffing about. We want to do it, we will do it, we can do it, and we won't accept any less. Thank you. Done.
Fabulous. John, thank you very much. And you kept beautifully to time as well. That's really good to know. So I'd like to encourage all of you with any kind of questions or clarifications from John's fabulous presentation to type into the chat box. We can start with Chris Deeves, who has a question for you, John. Chris, could you unmute and ask your question, please?
Yes, good morning, John. I was thinking about your pie chart of proportion of trips made by passenger vehicles. I wanted to test very carefully the assumption that those trips are simply made for the purpose of transporting the driver around. And when I make car trips, it's very seldom simply to move myself from one place to another. I'm either moving other people. Many people move children from activity to activity. Many people are delivering food, for instance, during COVID, going around and doing volunteer things. So I think you need to be very careful about what you disrupt if you simply remove passenger journeys. The supplementary question is, of course, that a lot of this is structural, and that the idea of a 15-minute city is probably more useful to deal with a lot of these issues than just concentrating on the vehicles themselves. Thank you.
Okay. Richard, shall I go and answer immediately?
Yes, please, John. I've got a couple of more questions lined up, but I'll come to those when you've answered.
Well, that's a very good question. And what it actually does is link to the world of, and the words are not helpful, transport demand management. When you look at any system of what trips people make, for what purpose, what they're carrying, are they carrying tools because they're plumbers and electricians or whatever, you always take great care to actually not to generalize. So for example, there's a large literature on how do you deal with single occupancy vehicles for commuter purposes? How do we deal with people who are going shopping to a supermarket when they might perhaps consider a delivery? So your point about the variety of kinds of trips is actually well taken care of, and nothing that I'm suggesting, or nothing that reduces car trips, for example, would disrupt the kind of things that people have to do, either for family reasons or business reasons or anything else. The fact remains is there's an enormous mass of trips that can be reduced and can be shifted to walk, cycle and bus without causing inconvenience. But you would never do anything that inconveniences people, and by the way, you take full account of those that are disabled. So that's part of the plan.
Fantastic. Thanks for that answer, John. Mike Streetley, could you unmute and ask your question, please?
Hi, John. Good to see you. I guess we're going to cover this afternoon a bit, but I suppose what can we do in Shropshire without the central government changing the overall framework in which we operate? Are we really stuck because of the rules and the way things work?
Yeah, I mean, we do operate within a national system that is unhelpful. There's no point ducking that issue. But equally, if you start interrogating what's going on in Britain, so let's say England, for example, you find that, for example, in Cornwall, they fully, a rural county council, Cornwall, can be compared to Shropshire, they fully implement the Bus Services 2017 Act, which gives them the powers to coordinate bus and trains. One ticket, for example, covers all buses and all trains. And they have a much better intelligent approach to developing high quality, attractive bus services than counties that don't. Shropshire does not take any advantage whatsoever of the Bus Services 2017 Act. Oxfordshire County Council, for example, have fully developed, and this is covered this afternoon in one of the presentations, a dreadful acronym, MAAS, Mobility as a Service, MAAS. That means that the whole transport system is reorganized so that you're able, when you want to make a journey, you use an app or whatever, smartphone, whatever they are, and you actually look at the cycling options, the bus options, the walking options, the car share options, and your own car, and it tells you what the cost is, it tells you what's available and allows you to book. Now, the Oxfordshire Council's doing that. These things don't happen in Shropshire. There is something in Shropshire which is very car-centric and unimaginative. So there's a lot of scope for local authorities. They have the legislative powers. They can do it. And the problem we have to address in Shropshire is doing a little bit of friendly, gentle prodding with not a very sharp stick to make sure these things happen in Shropshire.
Fabulous, John. Thank you. Tony Green, I call on you to ask your question.
Hello. I think, John, you've summarised the situation very well. And there's a question I think that will apply to most of what we'll talk about this afternoon in the groups, is we need to consider where the investment's going to come from. Is it going to come from individuals like us paying into the system, or is it local government, national government, and what's the role of the private business sector?
Yeah. Yeah. The interesting thing about investment is that, for a start, councils have a great deal of power, prudential borrowing power. So how did Gloucester get a new bus station? Gloucestershire Council raised the money itself and invested in the bus station. We could do the same. Where did Shropshire find the £17 million it's putting into the North West Relief Road around Shrewsbury? It didn't find it in a biscuit tin under the leader's bed. You know, it has used its prudential borrowing power to find 17 million to build a road. It is perfectly possible and for councils to use those powers. So we could, for example, have a new bus station. We could have a much enhanced park and ride in Ludlow. We could have high quality rural cycle routes that connect with trains and buses to encourage non-car based tourism to benefit the economy. You know, all of these powers exist. And councils are doing this in other parts of the country, but not so much in Shropshire. Businesses also, we have the Local Enterprise Partnership that has a substantial pot of money available for investing in things like sustainable transport. So they can be asked to reallocate some of it, whatever it is, £500 million towards these kind of projects. There isn't actually a shortage of money, but nationally and locally, it's not a criticism of Shropshire, it's a national problem. There is a predisposition to put the odd 5 or 10 million into a multi-storey car park or the odd 20 million into building a new road. And those amounts of money don't get put into improving walking, cycling and public transport. And they can do, and they should do if we are serious about decarbonising transport.
Great. Really interesting. So I'll call on Alan Wilson to ask his question, please. Alan.
Yes, Professor, with your skills and knowledge, are you any member of any think tank that the government would like to use your knowledge, or you're able to impart knowledge to them? Are you engaged that way?
I've tried very hard over the years. It will be boring to go into detail. I was appointed many years ago by John Prescott to be part of Rethinking Transport project group. I've been a member of the Prime Minister of Sweden's project group on fossil fuel-free Sweden, and I work with the Stockholm Environment Institute, which actually does advise governments all over the world. You know, interestingly, we're busier in China than we are in Britain. Britain doesn't use us very much, but China does use us. So yeah, I mean, there are opportunities and there are possibilities to do that kind of stuff. But the problem I find in Britain is that it's not a party political point either. Our centralised system of government based in London does not take advice very easily from the wide spectrum of sources of advice that can point to the potential for decarbonising transport. That there's something not right at the centre, and I'm not clever enough to work out what it is, but we could do so much better. There's no shortage. The Centre for Alternative Technology in Macunsworth does very well. The Tyndall Centre in Manchester does very well. You know, we're very well provided with good sources of information. Government does not tap into those sources of information.
Okay, thank you for your time.
Great. Thanks, Alan. And Lynn Mann, could you ask your question, please?
It wasn't so much as a question as a reflection on the reduce the need to travel. I think a part of this is you've got to change the whole infrastructure of society so that you don't have to travel. So in other words, you localise and not globalise, or centralise even, so that you have less far to travel to shops, to doctors, to work, to schools even. If I may, quickly, Cuba, after the peak oil crisis, all of a sudden they didn't have the fuel for cars, they didn't have the parts of cars, they couldn't rely on cars. So very quickly they had to decentralise healthcare, government, schools, lot, because the only way of getting around was by bike or horse.
Yeah.
It may take something that drastic, you know, such as not being able to use, well, we're literally in the same place, aren't we? We shouldn't be able to use cars at all. I'm saying that as a disabled person who uses a wheelchair. So that's not easy. I'm not coming from a place of privilege to say that.
Yeah. Thank you, Lynn. John, do you have any response to that?
I would just say that that's a good example of the kind of new way of thinking about things that we should do. We can actually change the co-location. I did a study some years ago of the transport impact of what we did when we closed 3,000 post offices, for example, in England. And that resulted in millions of people making longer journeys. So that added a lot of extra transport pressure on the highway system. The whole way that health services are organised and education provision is organised doesn't take account of distances that are generated by decisions that are made by the providers of those very vital services. So one of the things which your comment triggers in my mind is that when we're talking about decarbonising transport, we need to have a very clear idea about how we could reduce the need to travel by having a different approach to our post offices, our schools, our hospitals. I mean, why, for example, do people I know in Church Stretton, in non-COVID-19 times, why are they forced to travel into Shrewsbury when they are on disability benefits and they have to visit an office in Shrewsbury to say, I'm still here and I'm still alive and I'm okay, and they're not allowed to do it online and they're not allowed to do it by phone. People are made to travel. So we can reduce the need to travel. The important thing about that is not to disenfranchise, not to disadvantage any groups in society. And I definitely encourage co-location. Why are we trying to build 30,000 new homes, many of in Shropshire, in the local plan, many of which are on greenfield sites, miles away from any adequate public transport, and the possibilities for walking and cycling with your small children in a pushchair on a rural road are pretty grim. So we can alter that as well. There's a lot we can do locally, and we should do it.
Great, thank you. Gordon Copock, could you ask your question, please?
Hi, John. Thanks so far. It's very good. Your point about the weight of vehicles and the link to their overall efficiency is a really important one. It's also featured in the recent Absolute Zero report, which I'll share the links for. But the direction, even with EVs, is towards larger and heavier cars, including SUVs. And this is often perceived as a safety issue by their purchasers, but we really need to make this reverse. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, you put the point very well. It's interesting that when we talk about electric vehicles, and I'm very supportive of any zero carbon technology for the vehicles that remain, but we have to pay attention to the weight of vehicles, and we have to pay attention to it gets a bit tedious and techy, the life cycle analysis of the material content of vehicles. So when you're talking about batteries, for example, and so on and so on. So it's not a straightforward situation whereby I've got a really good idea, I'm going to get rid of all petrol and diesel and replace it with electric vehicles. If those vehicles are very heavy, for example, they will still consume a lot of extra raw materials, they'll still generate demand for building new roads, they still create particulate level PM 2.5 emissions that give us respiratory disease and so on and so on. So that's why avoid, shift, improve is important. It's not attacking the technology of electric vehicles. It's saying they have a role to play, but we've got to do the full Monty. We've got to do all the avoid and the shift and improve. And part of the improve is your point, which is vehicles need to be lighter. And that doesn't compromise safety, by the way. There's lots of European research on how to deal with that. And by the way, the best way to improve safety, which Shropshire Council rejected last year, is a 20-mile-per-hour speed limit on any road where people live and where people walk and cycle. And there's lots of ways of improving safety. We don't need to drive something from World War II that looks like a tank. You know, we can do it more intelligently. Thank you. It's a good point you made. Thank you.
Great. And the final question for this slot, John, from Denise Crampton-Thompson. Denise. Are you out there? Are you able to unmute?
Okay. Am I unmuted?
You are.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I didn't have a question.
Oh, was it a statement? Okay, it was about how we get to change attitudes unless we can change
Oh, I
council.
see. Okay, sorry.
So
I'm a bit.
take that as a statement.
I'm a bit anguished about this. We consistently have real problems with Shropshire Unitary Council because they seem to be going in totally the wrong direction in terms of their attitude to climate change and carbon reduction. And it seems that everything we try and get through to them in relation to improving their attitude just falls on deaf ears. So I'm quite convinced that we're not going to get anywhere unless we can get some change of attitude or change of councillors at SUC.
Great. Thank you, Denise. I don't think that needs a response, John. I think that was a good way to end. And maybe we look forward to our next election. So on behalf of all of you, can I give a rousing thank you? I don't quite know how we do this on Zoom. I'm not going to unmute you all and get applause, but if we can applause from the comfort of our own home. John, thank you ever so much for a fabulous beginning to our substantial part of the day. So thanks ever so much and enjoy the rest of your time in Sweden, sir.
Thank you and good luck to the whole project. Thank you.
Great. Thank you.